What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Couple housekeeping items we have to get out of the way. First of all, I've heard some people say that this is a Bears colored hat here. You got the orange and the navy blue. I just want to be very clear. I know it's a little bit tougher to tell. This is like a peach pink color. All right, so no Bears colors here. I promise it is not orange, and we are not repping anything Chicago Bears related. Second of all, I've heard a lot of people also say that they love my Notre Dame hat or they hate my Notre Dame hat. I want to also address the fact that this is not a Notre Dame hat. This is simply a Live Lucky hat. Nothing to do with Notre Dame in any way, shape, or form. Nothing against Notre Dame per se, but certainly not a Notre Dame fan. So just want to clear those things up right away. Not Bear colors, not Notre Dame fan. Let's move forward and move on, because I'm about to break all of your hearts and discuss things that are going to probably want to make you either drink a lot of alcohol or bleach or some other substance to try to erase all of this from your memory. But I do think sometimes, just in general, obviously I'm not in charge of the Packers here, but I do think just in general, in order to understand what might need to be done moving forward for the Packers to be successful, you have to sort of look back and see what went wrong and why they haven't been able to overcome 3 playoff series where arguably they could have, and in some cases probably should have won, and potentially be holding at least one more Lombardi trophy at this time, but they're not. So what went wrong? And I want to look at this not from like an in-game situation, right? For example, this is not going to be about Matt LaFleur's decision to kick the field goal against Tampa Bay rather than go for the touchdown, Will Redmond's missed interception, Mercedes Lewis, his random fumble, Aaron Rodgers, frankly, not playing well enough in a few of these big games. That's not what I'm talking about here, although we could very much have painful discussions on all of those things as well. What I want to focus on are just things that went wrong outside of the game, whether it was an injury, which we'll get to in just a moment, which I don't need to, probably sugarcoat, what I'm talking about. Whether it's a philosophy organizationally or from a front office standpoint, whether it was coaching decisions, whether it was like a far-reaching coaching philosophy, or whether it was a decision, like you'll see kind of what I'm getting at here. But I believe there are some breadcrumbs that lead us to the mistakes that the Packers have made that can give us a better idea as to why they have not been successful over the course of these last 3 seasons. And what I want to, before I get there, to again really make us all upset once again, before I get there, I do want to point out that the Packers deserve a crap ton of credit for doing a ton of things right. And from hiring Matt LaFleur and having him completely change the course of this organization, Brian Gutekunst finding players like Devondre Campbell and Rasul Douglas, going back like the Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith signings, Adrian Amos were phenomenal and completely changed the course of things. From draft picks with Brian Gutekunst that include Rashawn Gary, Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes. I mean, and there's a laundry list more that we could go over, Elton Jenkins, etc. Like getting some really premium draft picks really right and correct to get this team again to be able to compete for championships. Like there's a ton, and I mean a ton, that this organization has gotten right over the last handful of seasons. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite been enough, which again is why I believe that these things are worth talking about. So let's start off with, again, the most obvious, the most low-hanging fruit here, and that's David Bakhtiari's injury. There's no sugarcoating it. There's no way around it. There's no 2 ways about it. Bakhtiari's injury was massive. Whether it be getting hurt right before the playoffs in 2020, which led to Jason Pierre-Paul and Shaq Barrett and that entire Tampa Bay front having an easier line of sight to Aaron Rodgers, and Green Bay not being able to pass protect the way that they had all season long, that played a massive part in that game. And then missing him in basically all of 2021, including against the San Francisco 49ers, where once again you have to make some offensive line changes, and Nick Bosa's in that game, and Eric Armstead's in that game, and things just do not go according to plan. This is, and what the highest paid offensive tackle in football, arguably the best pass protecting left tackle in football, arguably the best tackle in football. To lose him for your arguably 2 of your biggest playoff runs, certainly in the Matt LaFleur era, but in a while, right? Since 2014, it stings so incredibly bad, and it's unlucky. It's a non-contact injury, a freak injury at the worst time. It's a series of events that cause him to not be able to come back in a year's time, which is fairly standard at this point to come back from an ACL, and miss another playoff series in 2021 going into 2022. It's just brutally bad luck. And listen, we could go through a laundry list of injuries, right? Green Bay has had their fair share of them over the last couple seasons. Now, I will argue in 2020 and in 2019, they actually, before the Bakhtiari injury, got pretty darn lucky with injuries. And, things were set to catch up with them eventually. We could go over Elton Jenkins, Jair Alexander, Zadarius Smith, and even those guys in the playoffs not being able to play maybe their full and normal role. But to me, injuries are a part of the game, and you have to be able to overcome. But when you just give this guy the biggest contract for an offensive tackle ever, and he's going into his prime and he's the best tackle in football, to lose him right before a 2020 playoff series and then not get him back in time for the 2021 playoffs, just brutal. And again, there's no two ways about it. That was a massive blow and a real big reason why Green Bay, in my opinion, wasn't able to compete better against either the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2020 or the San Francisco 49ers in 2021. Next is Green Bay's game plan against the 49ers in the NFC Championship in their front seven defensively against the 49ers. Simply put, the 49ers and Kyle Shanahan ate Mike Pettine's lunch, breakfast, dinner, stole his wife, just everything. I don't know if he has a wife, and if there's anything, forget I said that, but you'd get my point here. They completely demolished Mike Pettine in that game, and he had no chance. And when you go back and you watch that game, it was a lot of smaller defenses again. He tried a couple things here and there, but he gave his defense no chance against that Kyle Shanahan run game, to the point where I've said this before, and I believe this to this day. I don't believe that Jimmy Garoppolo would have needed to throw a single pass in that game for the 49ers to win. That's how dominant they were, and that's how awful the Packers defense were. And I do not believe that this is purely they didn't have the guys up front. We've seen Tyler Lancaster, Dean Lowry, Kenny Clark, and these, the same basically edge rushers. We've seen them, especially this last year, being able to stop the run. And they stood no chance against the 49ers. Kyle Shanahan was running circles around Pettine and was so far ahead of him. It was if you've always had those conversations of what if the 1960s Packers, were faced against the 2010 Packers, who would win that matchup? And it's if we're not adjusting for time variance and all of those things, can you imagine the 60s Packers getting up to the line of scrimmage and then Green Bay going audibles and hard count and just doing they would be so incredibly that's what it felt like. It looked like this defensive coordinator that came straight out of the 1960s was seeing some of this stuff for the first time. Throw 5 defensive linemen out there, do something to make Jimmy Garoppolo beat you. And his inability to game plan or adjust to the 49ers in any capacity to stop the run and make Jimmy Garoppolo beat them was atrocious, and it was a big downfall of that specific team. More of a philosophical thing from Green Bay's standpoint is prioritizing inside linebacker. Now they got, I don't know if lucky is completely the right word in getting Devondre Campbell this season. You have to give credit and kudos to the scouting staff and Brian Gutekunst for finding a diamond in the rough and bringing him in. But it's clear that inside linebacker has not been a priority for this franchise. And even Devondre Campbell was sort of a late minute pickup who's coming off a couple bad seasons, looked nothing like an all-pro, and it just fit and clicked. And again, you have to give some credit to the scouting staff and Brian Gutekunst in the front office. That to me just seems a little bit more, like I said, lucky's the wrong word, but you got a little lucky in that regards. They were that was a late free agent signing. They were about to go into the season, or into, the training camp and etc. with Ty Summers and Chris Barnes, and they took a flyer on Campbell, and luckily it paid off. But over the last few seasons, just bringing in inside linebackers to try to fill that role. Christian Kirksey, like it just, they haven't found that player up until Devondre Campbell. And I wholeheartedly believe 2020, 2019, not prioritizing that position overall was a big reason for the downfall of those two teams as well. So that's something that hasn't changed because you can't say they prioritized it this past season. Now Devondre Campbell's going to be a free agent. How do they fix that moving forward? Prioritizing inside linebacker. We saw the difference that Devondre Campbell has made, and now they have to adjust organizationally to say this position matters. Look at the Bucs and what they were able to do at that inside linebacker position. We talked about Logan Wilson, and he was phenomenal for the Bengals in that postseason and in that game. You know, to be fair, the Rams do not, like, that's their weakest position is inside linebacker, so they won a Super Bowl without it. But I would still strongly argue that the inside linebacker position is incredibly important, and Green Bay has sort of learned that position or learned that lesson the hard way up until finding Devondre Campbell. Next up is the coordinator hirings in 2019. Hire Matt LaFleur as head coach, get Nathaniel Hackett as offensive coordinator. We're on the right track. We've got some really great things going. However, one of the things that I hate when you're bringing in a new head coach is shotgun arrangements. And while it sounds like Matt LaFleur legitimately had Mike Pettin on his defensive coordinator list of candidates he would consider for defensive coordinator, it just always felt a little bit shotgunned. And I hate that. To me, if you're going to give a new coach the reins, give him the reins and say, hey, whoever you want to bring in. Now, it's tough to say. Maybe if Matt LaFleur was given full autonomy, maybe Mike Pettin would have been his guy. Maybe that would have been the case. And if it wouldn't have been Mike Pettin, maybe it would have been somebody worse. It's tough to know. But what I will say is there were some pretty darn good defensive coordinator candidates that were available that season, including Todd Bowles, Steve Spagnuolo, Patrick Graham, who was actually on the Packers staff, and they kept Pettin, of course, Vance Joseph, who was hired by the Cardinals as defensive coordinator that season, coming off of a head coaching stint. But I mean, Bowles would have been a home run hire. And obviously there were other options there too. Now, there may have been some timeline issues there. To be honest, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. I think Bowles was hired after LaFleur. I should have gone back and looked at that ahead of time. So correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe a couple of those were hired ahead of Matt LaFleur even getting hired. But either way, there were opportunities there where maybe Green Bay could have been more aggressive in finding a different defensive coordinator. They stuck with Pettin. Credit to Matt LaFleur for seemingly getting the Joe Barry hire right this time around, and it seems like they're much more on the right track. But you wonder if that shotgun marriage between Pettin and Matt LaFleur maybe wasn't the right decision. And again, there were other candidates that were potentially out there that could have been a really good fit had maybe they not gone internally with Mike Pettin. And then, of course, we get to the special teams coordinator. I've talked about this in the past. Darren Rizzi was out there. He leaves town. And again, maybe Rizzi was just looking for way too much money and it just wasn't workable. But not getting him in some capacity was a major loss. Sean Menenga was a complete bust as special teams coordinator. And then they made it worse when they moved on from Menenga and go to Mo Drayton. And of course, we see exactly what can happen when you don't have a solid special teams, and the 49ers game is, you don't need any more example than that. So again, philosophically, and we'll just go on the next list here, is because prioritizing special teams philosophically as an organization has let this team down. And again, we don't need to go into it in detail because we've covered it in great detail recently, especially with the 49ers game. So overall, the money that they've put into that special teams coordinator position, not prioritizing special teams enough just organizationally from a coaching standpoint, enough practice time, what players are designating for it, all of it has had massive negative effects. And again, it haunted them big time come 49ers Packers in the divisional round. Speaking of which, I also think they made a major mistake and misstep in taking Stephen Wordle and promoting him and making him the long snapper this season. Now, it's possible that maybe he was better than Hunter Bradley. Let me start by saying Hunter Bradley wasn't good either. So like making the move and making a change, I can understand the desire to do so. I'm not going to get too far into long snapper talk here, but I will tell you Carson Tinker is a long snapper who had played for the Buccaneers this year. They had two long snappers. He's available. He was hopping around the league, different practice squads. They could have gone out and gotten an established long snapper in Carson Tinker and not had to worry about well, is Steven Wirtle going to biff a snap or not hold up at the point of attack, etc.? And again, had they gone in that direction, maybe the blocked punt still happens, or maybe Tinker holds up a little bit better than what Steven Wirtle did. And to be clear, that was not on Steven Wirtle. He should have had help on that play. But maybe Hunter Bradley, even, who's a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, holds up like a half a second better. And maybe instead of that punt going way up in the air, maybe it's slightly blocked, but it goes 25 yards out of bounds, and the defense has the ability to get off the field, right? There's a lot of different things where if you're just a slightly better in that position, it's not a full-fledged block punt return for a touchdown. So not prioritizing long snapper, not getting that call right and going with Steven Wirtle, again, a major negative there. All right, a couple of the next ones are draft related, which you can always have hindsight being 2020, but I believe these two are valid. And one, I'm not going to surprise anyone here. And again, I have defended the Jordan Love draft pick in different capacities, or at least tried to give you both sides of the story. Wasn't my favorite pick at the time, was not what I would have done at the time. Did I understand the draft pick? Hell yeah, I understood the draft pick. But again, not what I would have done, not what I would have recommended, but more, I guess applaud's the wrong word, but I respect Brian Gutekunst for sticking to his draft board and making that decision if he was convicted by it. You better get it right if that's the case. Again, right now, not looking like that's the case, but there's still time and we'll see what happens. But I think we'll start with Jordan Love. And in that situation, with where that team was at, and looking at some of the long-term effects. Now, again, we have to look at it in the fact that 2019 Aaron Rodgers was not back-to-back MVP Aaron Rodgers. And he had a few years of far lower than standard play for Aaron Rodgers. And even 2019 was still well below normal expectations. So we have to remember that. However, you could take it in a couple different ways, saying, all right, we need to start preparing for life outside of Aaron Rodgers, or maybe Jordan Love drafting him motivates Aaron Rodgers. Or you could have looked at it and said, hey, let's go the opposite direction. We know this guy can be phenomenal. Let's get him a couple more weapons and let's see what he can do with that. Let's make his job easier. Let's make his life easier. Let's give him open targets and see what can happen there. And I do think that had they stayed at 27 and drafted either T. Higgins or Michael Pittman Jr., and you can absolutely say, like, Andy, benefit of hindsight, like both those guys, who knew, right? But like, those were two players that were end of first round caliber wide receivers, end of first, early second. And it's not like one of these guys were drafted in like pick 55. And I'm saying like, well, they should have drafted that guy at 27. Like, they should have known. The rest of the league didn't, but they should have known. Like, Michael Pittman and T. Higgins were drafted at picks 34 and 33 respectively. They originally held pick 27. And again, if you're not 1,000,000% sold, move back a handful of picks instead of moving up a handful of picks, and maybe keep your 4th round pick and maybe grab an extra 4th or 5th round pick in that scenario as well, and pick up a T. Higgins or a Michael Pittman Jr. Who are still on the board at that point. And there were other receivers that you could have looked at as well, but those two were the next two off the board, and both of them just seemed to fit so well as potential Packer receivers, especially Michael Pittman Jr. So I do think that you can have a level of criticism for saying, you know, hey, there's people get so upset and like it had to have been anyone other than Jordan Love, or there's shades of gray here. There's legitimate shades of gray always. And I do understand, and again, respect the Jordan Love pick, and who knows what happens. Like, some of these things are so crazy. As I mentioned yesterday, there were 4 players in that draft that are out of the league. They could have drafted Isaiah Wilson or Jeff Gladney, and no one would have said crap at all. They would have been like, okay, new offensive tackle, new corner. I love Jeff Gladney in that draft. They pick either of those guys, and everyone's totally fine with it. And they're both out of the league. Nobody's criticizing Brian Gutekunst to the level that they are for drafting Jordan Love. I could even make a bigger argument and say, like, because I hear Patrick Queen all the time, it sounds like they were actually interested in Jordan Brooks and not Patrick Queen. But let's say they draft either Jordan Brooks or Patrick Queen there. I can actually make an argument that that pick is worse, far worse than Jordan Love, because not only did they draft them, but they probably never signed Devondre Campbell, who is way better than either of those guys. And by the way, Jordan Brooks and Patrick Queen, neither of them have been good. So I hear those all the time, and I'm like, have you seen either of them play? Because they haven't been good. So, like, the domino effects of some of these things, you never quite know. Maybe no Jordan Love, maybe Aaron Rodgers never plays to an MVP standard for 2 seasons. And maybe they're nowhere near as good or even sniffing opportunities to win, an NFC championship game against Tampa. So you never know, but I do think that there's a fair argument to be made of saying, hey, T. Higgins, Michael Pittman would have made a lot more sense and given this team over the last 2 seasons a better opportunity to succeed. On the same token, again, this is one where we can nitpick and go back and forth and say hindsight is 2020, but the reason I don't believe this is the case is Creed Humphrey versus Josh Myers. The consensus going into that is Humphrey over Myers. And Humphrey had some injury issues. I understand that. Not maybe quite the size and bulk of a Josh Myers, but just about every consensus going in was Humphrey ahead of Myers. And I certainly would have said at the time, Humphrey over Myers. And I wasn't like the biggest Humphrey guy in the world. And I actually liked Myers going into that draft quite a bit. So like the difference between the two for like most people was like Humphrey should be a first-round pick, Myers should be a third-round pick, and there's this massive gap between the two. I was more like Humphrey's a late second, Myers is an early third. And that's basically what they ended up being. And I liked Humphrey better. And in hindsight, most of the other people were right? Josh Myers played more like a third-round pick, although he played well. And again, this isn't more of like a referendum on Josh Myers because I think he's going to have a really good career in Green Bay and be a long-term center for the Packers. But he's not Creed Humphrey. And Creed Humphrey was phenomenal last season. He was phenomenal at Oklahoma. And that would have been potentially a completely improved player on the Packers offensive line this past season where like every little bit would have helped against the 49ers. I think they would have ran the ball a little bit better, maybe pass protected inside a little bit better, although I do think Josh Myers actually had one of his best games against the 49ers. But still, adding a Creed Humphrey to that potentially could have helped things for the Packers as they played that season and as they played against the 49ers and gone into the playoffs that they were able to beat the 49ers. I think that's another one that you can absolutely question. Couple other philosophical ones here, prioritizing number 2 wide receiver. And I've fought this a little bit because, again, I think Green Bay has had far more than enough weapons. But I will say, when I was watching, and I've mentioned this in the past as well, when I watched the difference between the Packers against the 49ers this year and the Rams against the 49ers this year, one had Cooper Kupp, one had Devontae Adams. They both had arguably the top 2 wide receivers in the – I'm not even arguably. The top 2 wide receivers in the NFL. Each of them had one of them. But the difference, to me, it wasn't Stafford or Rodgers. It wasn't the running backs. It wasn't the blocking on the offensive line. The difference to me was Odell Beckham at the number 2 wide receiver position. Notice how you will not hear me saying not getting Odell Beckham was a problem because Beckham wanted to go to the Rams and Green Bay couldn't do anything financially to up that offer to make it more of an incentive for him to come to Green Bay. He was going to be a Ram, and oh, by the way, he chose correctly. They won the freaking Super Bowl. So tough to blame Odell Beckham and tough to blame the Packers in that situation, but not prioritizing that number 2, I do think has hurt Green Bay. I think it hurt them against the Buccaneers, where MVS had a pretty darn good game against the Bucs, but overall they struggled separating from Tampa Bay's coverage in that game. And I think it definitely hurt them against the 49ers as well. They went out of their way to take away Devontae Adams. Now, yes, we can talk about the open plays where they had to Josiah DeGuara and Alan Lazard, and Rodgers just didn't play well in that game. However, you have a legit top-tier number 2 wide receiver in that game. And yeah, maybe Aaron Rodgers is looking that way a little bit more with Devontae in double and triple coverage. Instead, for a lot of that game, the wide receivers, Randall Cobb, Alan Lazard, are not getting open. So what happens when you come to a key play in the game? Even though Alan Lazard's the designed route and he's open on the play, he hasn't been all for a lot of the game, and I'm going to go to Devontae Adams, and that's what happened. But if you have another guy who is consistently getting open, Rodgers probably looking that way a tad bit more. And I do think ultimately, I know MVS is hurt in that game, which changed things as well. But I think not having another number 2 guy has hurt them and has ultimately hurt this offense. A couple last ones really quick. Kevin King over Tramon Williams against the Buccaneers when Kevin King was coming off of an injury, or at least not changing that at any point, I think was an egregious mistake. And again, that one might have a little bit of hindsight in it, but remember, King was already struggling and he was hurt going into that week. And Tramon Williams had mentioned on multiple occasions that he was ready to start that game. I think if they do that, I things might have been quite a bit different. Kevin King was awful in that game and a huge reason the Packers lost. And then we could also talk about Billy Turner and Dennis Kelly starting at offensive tackle, Turner at left, Kelly at right. I understood the decision. I think that one is a little bit more hindsight related, but it didn't work out. And because of that, you certainly have the right to second guess it. These, to me, are the reasons that Green Bay is not currently holding another Lombardi trophy. And again, I think these are things that Green Bay has to learn from. I think they have already started to learn from some of it, right? Special teams. They've prioritized special teams coach Rich Bisaccia, brought on a new assistant special teams coach, and I believe you're going to see them take a different approach to special teams. Some of it's luck, right? David Bakhtiari, not much you can do about that. The game plan against the 49ers in the NFC Championship game. They've gone with a new defensive coordinator and have had much better plans against the run in the last couple seasons. We'll see if they can start prioritizing inside linebacker. Just some of these decisions that have maybe gone against them maybe could have propelled them instead of going against them. And I think that's why it's important to look back and see what Green Bay needs to learn so that they can be better moving forward. And what I'll ultimately end with here is the margins for victory in winning a Super Bowl are razor thin. Yeah, Green Bay was probably a better team than 49ers or the Rams or the Bengals. They didn't win a Super Bowl, so it doesn't matter. They made mistakes at key moments, and some of these issues, not prioritizing special teams, not having a legit number two wide receiver to take maybe some pressure off of Adams and Rodgers. Like, some of those things are legitimate things that you can look to and say, hey, maybe they do that differently. Maybe Green Bay was still playing. Maybe they were playing yesterday, had an opportunity for a Super Bowl. These are things that they're going to have to find ways to correct moving forward. Now they're going to have to find ways to do it with a lot less salary cap space and the ability to go out and find free agents that could maybe plug a couple of these holes that Green Bay has. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. Always appreciate it. I'll be right back here tomorrow with an all-new episode. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.